Good morning. Today I'm going to talk about forest biomes, forest development, and the nature of different forests in different systems, and how seasonality and dynamics of the forest species that occupy forests change how forests really work. And we'll have a special focus towards the end on ecosystem carbon, uh, mainly because this is a lot of the currency in which we can really evaluate forest succession and change through time. It's also a topic that's of obvious importance globally right now. So it ties our observations in our local forests to global patterns and processes. So that makes it really fascinating. All right, well, let's jump into it. Um, Many of you have probably in the past been exposed to the concept of biomes. And so this should be no news to you that one of the coarsest levels at which we can start evaluating ecosystems is in terms of their organization is thinking about forest biomes. So uh, similar types of vegetation, or similar vegetation, what we call physiognomy, or the appearance, general appearance, and stature of vegetation. Um, Differences in physiognomy can result in really clear differences in ecosystem structure that are most easily recognized as biomes. And so you've seen some map like this, I'm sure, in the past, where different biomes are represented here. So you can see that we have tropical forests in light green. You can see how they really dominate around the Earth's equator. And then our temperate forests and boreal forests are represented by some of the darker colors of blue and green towards the top of your screen, with just a smattering of those forests in the southern hemisphere. Some of the earliest attempts to think about biomes thought about just coarse measures of climate like mean annual temperature and precipitation. This is a graph from Whitaker in 1975. Robert Whitaker was a very influential plant ecologist. And Whitaker tackled the concept of biomes graphically this way by kind of realizing that you could draw some amorphous, kind of strange looking polygons or bounds around different biomes based on bounds in mean annual precipitation or mean annual temperature. So tropical rainforests are somewhere north of 260 centimeters of rainfall. That's over 2.5 meters of rainfall a year, up to 450 or so centimeters of rainfall. That's 4.5 meters of rainfall a year. And then mean annual temperature that generally is greater than 20 degrees Celsius and upwards of 27, 28. On the other hand, you could look at boreal forests, which with a much lower mean annual temperature, somewhere between, say, negative 5 degrees and 2.5 degrees mean annual temperature. But then the annual precipitation will be somewhere between 100 to 200 centimeters of rainfall per year. Temperate forests and temperate rainforests fall right in the middle. And so our region in the Northwest in Olympia, we fall solidly in the temperate rainforest category most of the time, or temperate forest category, depending on where you are. Um, so, in Olympia, we probably get low enough rainfall that we're solidly in the temperate forest category most of the time. Temperate rainforest requires a little bit more rainfall, more like what we see out on the Olympic Peninsula. But people differ a little bit in how they think about this. From before the time of biomes, when we think about scales of organization in forests, biomes are falling really at the coarsest level. So we're going from, okay, we've got a planet, to the next scale of organization for ecosystems is, okay, we've got these biomes, this dominant physiognomy that's pretty easy to see. Then we start looking at landscapes, stands, and then all the way to genotypes. My expertise as a research in the past has been at the level of thinking about genetic variation in dominant trees and how that might affect ecosystems, properties of ecosystems. But moving out from that, we might think about how diversity of trees within stands affects ecosystems. And then landscapes and biomes are larger levels still. So oftentimes as ecologists, we're focusing on multiple of these scales at the same time. We're nesting our questions within biomes, within landscapes, and then maybe we're asking finer questions within those levels of organization. Just to start with here, and just to kind of get us all on the same page of thinking about forests broadly, we're going to talk about 6 different forests now. These 6 forests are going to give us a kind of a brief tour through some really different systems. And so this is by no means exhaustive, but it just kind of gives us a way to kind of get our thinking started about how forests can differ. As we do this, it's important to recognize that not only do we have different physiognomies or general structure of our vegetation, but the actual productivity of our vegetation is going to be really different in these different systems. One way to look at this that's been really fascinating in recent years is through use of the vegetation, the NDVI index, a vegetation index that really measures greenness of vegetation. And has been interpreted from satellite photos or satellite measurements. So we get a remote sensing ability now with our satellites that allows us to get measures of greenness or even vegetation productivity from space, which is pretty powerful when we're trying to think of patterns on a global scale. So let's just watch this little clip for a minute, and then we'll delve into some examples of several different forests, beginning with the Amazon. So in this video, as the years are going by, you can see the flux of, in the Northern Hemisphere, see the flux of green associated with summer, and then grayer tones associated with winter from year to year. And the date is flipping by on the screen. You can see us going from 2008, 2009. Think about where you were during those different summers and different winters, since we have all participated now in these types of cycles. Notice how unchanging too certain regions of the tropics are. So some portions of the tropics near the equatorial belt are green and photosynthetically active in a strong way year-round. Other portions of the tropics are actually pretty seasonal, and so you see fluxes where we have reduced greenness in a dry season in some of the tropics, and that'll come into play as we talk about what happens, especially in Amazon rainforests. So first, let's talk about the Amazon. I'll show you some pictures from the far western Amazon in Ecuadorian Amazon Basin, Amazon rainforest on the east side of the Andes. The Amazon is strikingly flat if you've traveled into this basin. I think it's probably one of the most surprising features of this system is just how flat it is. So, for example, going from the east side of the Andes all the way out to the Atlantic Ocean, you can get a change of less than 300 meters over 3,000 kilometers, and so that's an impressively flat landscape. But within that landscape, you have forests with a high, what we call alpha diversity and gamma diversity. And so when we think of the difference between alpha, beta, and gamma diversity, alpha diversity is kind of our plot level or local level diversity. How many species do you have in an individual plot in a small area? And gamma diversity is the amount of diversity in a larger region, or what you're measuring. Whereas beta diversity is really how many species increase as you go from one location to the next. The Amazon rainforest is known for having high diversity, and of course all of these forms, alpha, beta, and gamma diversity, but especially alpha and gamma diversity. High rainfall in these regions, over 3 meters a year, and these are typically old or phosphorus-limited soils. So when we think of phosphorus cycles, which we'll get into later, we think of phosphorus arising from rock as the ultimate source of phosphorus. There's not much of an atmospheric phosphorus cycle. And so you get phosphorus weathered out of rock, and in high temperature systems that are warm, systems that are wet with a lot of precipitation, we get a lot of eventual leaching of that phosphorus out of the system. And so the ecosystem ends up being limited in phosphorus because the source has been depleted through time. This is very different than the nitrogen cycle, where we have a significant atmospheric input of nitrogen on an annual basis. One of the surprises to many people that was really apparent in 2019 is that some of these forests, even Amazon rainforests, do have a dry season. And the dry seasons can be accompanied by strong fire seasons. And so you can have a high abundance of fires at certain times of the year, and especially what for us is often summertime. And so here you can see a graph of fires through time, 2012 through 2018, and we're looking at the number of fires within the Amazon basin near Manaus. And you can see that typically around the 250th day of the year, we get sharp jumps in the numbers of fires. A lot of this is associated with anthropogenic burning of forests, but not necessarily old growth forests. This can be clearing of second growth forest. Often farmers will go through multiple cycles of clearing the same forest and burning them. Of course, from space, it's still very striking. We know this region for high diversity, and to see any of this area on fire is a bit gut-wrenching if you care about biodiversity on the planet. Here's an example of that from 2019. I'm showing the Amazon basin coupled with a map of fires. This is a bit of an exaggerated map of fires in the basin, I believe, but still it shows you the location of fires during late summer in 2019. You can see an abundance of fires in the southern area of the Amazon basin. This gathered worldwide attention, celebrity attention, a lot of concern for Amazon rainforests burning and disappearing. Of course, they are still disappearing at an alarming rate. And of course, there are new threats to the Amazon rainforest now, associated with the coupling of human disease and deforestation and economic turmoil associated with the COVID-19 outbreak worldwide. So the Amazon basin is by no means secure from threats of deforestation, and we've still been seeing a lot of deforestation in recent years. One of the most striking examples of deforestation have been the series of images in Rhodonia. In Rhodonia, there have been repeat photographs for years showing the influence of anthropogenic cutting and expansion of slash and burn or cut and burn agriculture. So, for example, in this image along the bottom here, you can see a sequence of images progressing through time, showing the influx of roads followed by agriculture into the basin. And I encourage you to go to Google Earth, where you can get detailed photo sequences of this deforestation in that region. In the text here, it says in the past 3 decades, clearing and degradation of the state's forest have been rapid. I guess we could call this greater than 3 decades now. It's been an extensive amount of time, 4 decades now, of clearing in this region. It's dramatic. In this text, we're saying by 2003, an estimated size of rainforest larger than the state of West Virginia had been cleared, and by now, it's more than that still, since we're 17 years down the road from that statistic. In portions of the Amazon, there's still tremendous diversity, a lot of it occupied by people who consider it their ancestral homeland. A lot of indigenous groups still occupy vast stretches of the Amazon rainforest. And many of these groups use the forest extensively, including tree species that we use tree species for. all sorts of purposes, from building purposes to medicinal purposes, you name it. So these are some images from a tribe that I visited in the eastern Andes in the West Amazon Basin a couple years ago. A really diverse forest. The little placard on one of the trees there is for ecotourism. They put this up to help communicate to people what different trees are used for. Many of these trees are hard to recognize from the ground. But if you know enough about the trees in terms of their smell, their texture, their taste, it becomes easier to recognize them. Many of these communities live along broad river floodplains. This has been important in the era of the COVID epidemic because boat transportation is so common, which puts people in close contact on boats to travel from village to village. Many of these villages will clear area around small huts where people will stay, live, cook, eat, and gather. So forest clearing is not unnatural in small gaps in portions of the Amazon basin where this has been a practice for thousands and thousands of years. However, the large clearing associated with modern agriculture and anthropogenic influences is, of course, novel to the system. Another diverse system that's in our temperate region and a system that has analogs in other parts of temperate forests are eastern hardwood forests. And these are really important to focus on as students of forests because a lot of what we know about forest ecology, or we think we know as scientists, as forest scientists, comes from long-term studies in eastern forests. So there are portions of the world with dramatic forests that are really important, but they haven't contributed to our conceptual understanding of forests the same way eastern forests have, largely because of the coupling of kind of the development of academic culture in eastern forests in the United States and Europe. There are several really interesting things to keep in mind about eastern forests. One of them is that they're incredibly diverse, and so that's not necessarily on this slide. So we think of here in the West Coast, it's easy to think of the eastern forests as a monolithic block, and of course they're not. They're incredibly diverse forests with very different forest types as you move from south to west. Less so as you move from west to east, though there is a bit of a predictable change as you go from the East Coast inland, especially into the Mississippi Valley. These forests are likely to be affected by climate change, and so we're likely to see a lot of change in these forests as we move forward into the future. They share some characteristics, though, because a lot of eastern forest regions are dominated by deciduous tree species with an intermediate or early succession pine dominance phase. They tend to have distinct seasonality of canopy cover, which of course makes the East famous for fall colors. A strong influence of agriculture, either current or former. The red truck and barn in the photo here are from a former greener's farm that I visited in Vermont in 2019. These forests are known for not only their diverse tree species, but also diverse hybrid zones, and especially diverse hybrid zones of oaks, which hopefully we'll get a chance to talk about more later. Early studies really focused on the importance of leaf litter and nutrient cycles. Because of the deciduous habit of these trees, a lot of the nutrient capital of these trees is released through leaf fall in one big pulse in the fall, which you can measure by capturing it and measuring the chemical content of those leaves. And the decomposition of that leaf litter is really important for regrowth the following spring. There have also been some really important losses of tree species in eastern forests. And so what we recognize as eastern forests now are probably extremely different from what people recognized as eastern forests at the time of European colonization, when elm trees and chestnut trees in particular were more abundant. Additionally, one other factor that makes eastern forests really important generically to understand is that the abandonment of agricultural fields has resulted in a recovery of forests and eastern landscapes that, especially throughout the 20th century, really contributed heavily to our conceptual ideas around what happens in forest succession or how forests change through time. So we call this old field succession. And there's a little graphic here on the slide for you to take a look at. But the idea is that there is a predictable sequence of vegetation stages that will proceed following field abandonment, and then this is this kind of natural gradation in how you go from young ecosystems to old ecosystems. Of course, it's a little different here in the Pacific Northwest, but this was a major conceptual cornerstone of how eastern forests were considered, and it contributed to our understanding of how forest succession happens in systems all over the world. There are classic study sites in eastern forests that you should be aware of as a student of forest ecology. These forest sites are typically all characterized by having relatively high rainfall in summer, which is very different from western and especially Pacific Northwestern forests. Regardless, though, there are classic biogeochemistry studies which are really important to know about. First off, the Indiana dunes. I'll show you some pictures of this in a bit. This is another case where succession on a certain landscape, in this case Indiana dunes by Chicago, contributed heavily to how we think about how succession proceeds in systems. At Coweta LTER in the Carolinas, there have been watershed studies that were really important to understanding forest hydrology and how forests contribute to hydrological processes. Similarly, Hubbard Brook, which is a long-term ecological research site, has had classic watershed biogeochemistry studies where whole watersheds were cleared of vegetation, and then the chemistry of the stream waters that come through the watershed were studied to help understand how forests contribute to biogeochemical cycles. These have been really important studies, and they really provide the foundation of our understanding of nutrient limitation in ecosystems and how vegetation cover contributes at a watershed scale to nutrient content of both stream waters and ecosystems in general. In Harvard Forest, there have been classic community studies in addition to classic biogeochemistry studies, a really important location to know about. Studies of forest succession in Michigan and nearby locations have really defined how we think about forest gaps and the influence of small-scale disturbances associated with tree fall in studies, and stages of forest development associated with gap phase or gap dynamics in forests. And then finally, this lowermost check mark down by the purple dot here, Savannah River LTER, long-term ecological research site, has revolutionized the use of isotopes in ecology. So Savannah River was a site where people first started using isotopes as tracers in ecological systems to understand where certain elements went in ecosystems, how they moved, and what kind of quantities, what sort of amounts. So there have been multiple, all of this is to say there are multiple sites and many that are left off here, that multiple sites in the East that have formed classic studies that have really informed the paradigm of how we think about forests. So it's good to keep that in mind as we roll through Northwestern forests and think about how our ecosystems in the Northwest here are structured or how they might function. A good amount of what we think our default for thinking about Northwestern forests might actually be informed by a completely different forest type, deciduous dominated Eastern forests, where multiple classic and really important studies of both biogeochemistry and community ecology have taken place. A few other things to say about Eastern forests include reiterating that the distinct seasonality is really important for these forests. The spring wildflower dynamics in these forests are really important because these are canopies that tend to close up when they're deciduous covered in the summer, meaning that they have dark interior forests, light conditions in the summertime, where in the springtime it's the reverse. Open canopies that haven't leafed out yet tend to let a lot of light through, and so you get this really excessive peak in annual especially, but wildflower generation in the understory in the spring that quickly goes away as the summer progresses. A little different than some other systems we might be used to here in the West, where we can have wildflower seasons that peak all the way into midsummer. In eastern forests, they're going to peak earlier than that. The eastern forests, I'll just reiterate that they've been dramatically altered by at least two exotic diseases, chestnut blight and Dutch elm disease. These are really important diseases for eastern forests, and we'll go into detail on talking about those diseases in the next talk. These pathogens have eliminated tree species that were dominant, and so we had foundation tree species that dominated these systems that have fallen away. They have relatively high alpha diversity. So you go to one location, and as you can see in the multicolored photo of tree canopies here, and in any one location, any single hectare is going to contain a high number of species. That doesn't necessarily always equate to high gamma diversity, but as you go to the whole region, you might keep seeing the same species. But on a local level, you have high diversity of species co-occurring, which could relate to their resilience. We have major diseases come through and wipe out chestnut or Dutch elm, but we still have a deciduous forest type. So the forest type has been somewhat resilient, even though we've lost major species. And it's also important to recognize that in many regions in the East, forest area has actually increased in the past century as a result of old field succession. Okay. With that, we're going to take a short pause, and then in the next video, we're going to jump right in with chestnut blight, and we'll talk about chestnut blight, Dutch elm disease, and the other forest types that I promised to talk about.